Hey everybody! Today's about Protune. I will show you what settings I think are best and explain why. At the same time I'll show you some magical and beautiful places. So take your time for the next 5 minutes. You won't regret it. When we look at Protune in the overview, we notice that the upper row is about exposure, that means how bright or dark the image is. Below we find settings for white balance, sharpness, color and audio. Let's start with the exposure, with the upper row. These options should actually be considered together. The first setting we can make refers to the shutter speed, that is the length of the exposure time. Basically, the longer the exposure time, the brighter the image. The shutter speed affects not only the exposure but also the motion blur. For video recording, the optimum motion blur is obtained when the shutter speed is twice the frame rate. If you shoot at 30 frames per second, the shutter speed should be at 1/60th of a second for optimal results. If the shutter speed is too high, the picture looks nervous and jittery, as I've already shown in other tutorials. If the shutter speed is too low, the image appears smudgy and blurred. The problem is that, as you can see, the image is clearly too bright in daylight with all the options available here. So when should you change the shutter speed manually? Only if you use ND filters that limit the light incidence or possibly in low light. In all other cases it makes sense to leave the shutter speed on auto. For the optimal settings for low light I will do another tutorial, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're new here. Now let's look at the ISO settings. The ISO value represents the camera's sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO value, the more light sensitive the sensor. So if you shoot in low light, a higher ISO value helps for a brighter image. The problem is that the image quality decreases with higher ISO values. The result is an image noise. GoPro is particularly affected by this and starts to produce a lot of noise even at relatively low ISO values. I would therefore not recommend an ISO value above 400. This is not a problem in daylight anyway, as we have too much light rather than too less. In daylight you can therefore set the ISO value to 100. I usually set the minimum value to 100 and the maximum value to 400. Only if you really need it, I would consider an ISO value of 800. Since the GoPro has a fixed aperture, the correct exposure is exclusively achieved by shutter speed and ISO. In daylight we usually use an ISO value of 100 and the camera will automatically produce the correct exposure using the shutter speed if you set it to automatic. If you have the impression that the automatic exposure mode of the camera produces an image that is too bright or too dark, you can correct this using the exposure value compensation. Values above 0 produce a brighter image, negative values a darker image. You have to decide that depending on the situation, and there is no best value for all situations. Remember however that you cannot save an overexposed image in post. The detail of the burnt out highlights are lost. On the other hand, if you underexpose your image, you can usually still recover most details from the shadows. To show you this, I took another shot with different exposure settings and then corrected it in post. As you can see, the shots with negative exposure compensation hardly differ from each other, as I could always recover the details from the shadows, while the overexposed recordings could not be saved. Even when shooting without exposure compensation, the image has burnt out areas. It is therefore recommended that you use a slightly negative value for the exposure value compensation in most situations, especially if you intend to edit your videos in post. By default, I therefore choose -0.5. Now let's take a look at the settings of the bottom row. White balance is about the correct color temperature of your shot. That is how warm or cool the shot should look. The white balance is basically correct if white looks really white, unless you are consciously looking for a particularly warm or cool look. Depending on the light source, so depending whether the light source is sunlight or artificial light, the white balance must be adjusted. The camera can do this automatically and the GoPro usually does it well. The only problem is that the camera may make changes during the same recording. This looks strange and is especially annoying if you want to adjust and change the colors of your shot in post. For this reason, it may make sense to fix the white balance manually. If you're not interested in changing the white balance manually every time, there is another alternative, called Native. Native allows easy and effective editing in post, as the camera stores most of the information. That's why I almost always use this setting for white balance. However, this only makes sense if you're editing your videos. With Native, the image usually has a slight red cast, which needs to be corrected in post. The sharpness is automatically set to high. This means that the camera artificially sharpens the image internally. It's like adding sharpness in Photoshop. This makes the image look very digital and unnatural. You can set the sharpness to medium or low to prevent this effect. Low has a rather washed out look in some cases and sometimes requires resharpening in post. Therefore, I usually use medium as default setting. In terms of color, you have two choices, GoPro or flat. GoPro creates a well-saturated image. Flat, on the other hand, produces a rather unsaturated and low contrast image. It is a log profile. The advantage of this is that more details are recorded in the shadows and highlights. This improves the dynamic range of the recording. It is also easier to edit such an image. So if you want to grade your shot or match it to recordings of another camera, you should set the color to flat. And don't forget that color grading can make the difference between a normal and great shot. That's why I always choose flat. At the setting audio, you have the option that the camera saves a WAV file in addition to the sound of the video file. You can then use this WAV file for editing. Depending on whether you select low, medium or high, you will get a file that is hardly medium or heavily processed by the camera. For a barely processed audio file, you would have to choose low. I never use that option. Personally, I consider the audio quality of GoPro to be one of its greatest weaknesses. It uses the sound for a few sound effects at most. So my optimal settings for Protune are Shutter Auto, exposure value compensation minus 0.5, ISO minimum 100, ISO maximum 400, white balance native, sharpness medium, color flat and audio off. I hope this video was helpful to you. If you're interested in more tutorials like this, subscribe to the channel and I will see you soon.